Today, we're going to break it down for Sony fans and Sony skeptics. What is the Sony tax really paying for? Everyone says that Sony TVs are overpriced. They're like, wait a minute, on paper, this Sony TV appears to be underpowered. The specs simply do not justify the premium. By the end of this video, you'll know all about what this Sony tax is really about. In the meantime, if you are interested in getting a Sony TV, check out the best and most knowledgeable Sony TV retailer, Value Electronics. Stop the FOMO because Value Electronics has everything you need to build the man cave of your dreams. Even if you're not ready for the ultimate home theater experience, Value Electronics can still set you up with the best TV for you from Sony, LG, Samsung, Hisense, TCL. Since the very start of this channel, I've bought several flagship TVs from Robert. And if you tell him FOMO sent you, more goodies. So yeah, check out Value Electronics today. The complaint about Sony TVs is not that they're not great. They're awesome. It's that you're paying a little bit too much for the Sony name. They call it the Sony tax. And the reason they call it the Sony tax is similarly priced TVs as a Sony TV appear to have better specs. Like, wait a minute, the Samsung, TCL, Hisense, the specs on paper are just like the Sony, but then the Sony costs a few $100s more. In some cases, maybe even $1,000 more. But on paper, the brightness appears to be either worse or at best the same, but costs so much more. So we're talking about things like number of dimming zones, peak brightness, maybe even contrast, right? You're like, wait, I'm looking at this sheet of paper and that Sony TV, it doesn't have the numbers that match and support the price because a similarly priced TCL, Hisense, Samsung, and sometimes LG OLED TVs, they appear to have better specs on paper for the same price or even less. So today we're going to unpack Sony's TV philosophy when they're making their TVs, when they're putting together the specs, what it is they're actually designing for, and why, unfortunately, as reviewers, we're so focused on these specs, we don't focus on what's really important to all of us. How does it look watching a movie? And we're going to get back to that shortly. So the Sony tax, you're overpaying for what appears to be, quote unquote, a lesser spec TV. Or is it? So let's get into what I think Sony is really doing. And this is based on three things. One, my very first Sony TV to be reviewed was the A9G. Then it was the A90J. Then it was the A95K. Then it was the A95L. And this year is the Bravia 8 Mark II. The best Sony OLED TVs. Some of them even won the King of TVs. Wait a minute. I think all five of them won the King of TVs. Additionally, I've reviewed a lot of their LCD TVs, the X900H, the Bravia 9, the Bravia 7, the Bravia 5 is still in review, the A95, no, the X95K or something, X93, right? All of these TVs that Sony has produced, whether it's LCD or OLED, I consider myself an authority on reviewing Sony TVs. And I don't just review Sony TVs. My favorite TV of 2019 actually was the Samsung Q90R. Now the A9G was great, it was OLED. Untouchable when it comes to contrast and that perfect color. But the Q90R had a slightly more visual impact because at the time, LCD TVs, QLED, it really popped, right? So Samsung TVs, QN98, QN90B, QN95C, or 95A, 95B, 95C, LG OLEDs, right? G5, G4, I've seen them all. And TCLs, the 6 series, TCL Mini LED series, Hisense from the very beginning, the very first awesome model, I reviewed it. So I really have some context to compare what Sony's doing and why the Sony tax to me, I mean, it still bothers me, by the way. So I'm not defending Sony. Let me tell you this. The number one complaint I receive from you all, and the number one complaint I have with Sony is, why are you charging me this much for a TV that appears to be a lesser TV? And so we're going to talk about it right now. Now let's start with the basics, the people, the culture. I visited Sony headquarters several months ago at the beginning of the year, right? Tokyo. I wanted to get a feel for the designers, the engineering team. You know, how do they get from A to C, right? A to Z, from concept to delivery. And what I discovered was very interesting, which is generationally, The individual that was working on the Trinitron in the 80s, he's still there. And he's training the next generation of engineers that developed the Bravia 9, next year's RGB LED. He is still there. Even though he should be retired, he still hangs around because he loves working at Sony. And the people that have taken his place, they've been around since the very beginning of their career as TV engineers, TV designers. And I thought, wait a minute, the turnover here, there is none. It is that classic old school way of doing business where you're handing down all your knowledge, and it's an apprenticeship essentially from what you learned over 30 years of the first Sony CRT to the Trinitron, passing what your philosophy is on how a TV should look to the next generation. So although we have the latest in QD OLED, right, OLED technology, or RGB LED that's coming out next year, or mini LED, or LC, it doesn't matter, plasma, there is this one philosophy that is consistent, and I've noticed this between the different TV technologies by Sony. Color. That's something that Sony hammers into their people. Play with all the technology you want, play with all the contrast you want, the brightness, all of that. But the one thing that cannot change is, are the skin tones natural? They have a specific Sony look that I'm noticing doesn't change from generation to generation, regardless of the technology. And this is being handed down from one generation to the next. So let's get to what's important to you as a TV consumer. Image quality. And we'll start with the flagship technology, right? The OLED panels. Whether it's WOLED or RGB primary OLED or QD OLED, it doesn't matter, right? Sony likes to choose the best OLED that fits their philosophy. So we'll go with the Sony A9G, A9G, A90J, A95K, A95L, and this year Bravia 8 Mark II. All flagship OLED TVs from Sony. Now, what do they have in common? On the spec sheets, all of these Sony flagship TVs consistently underperform in peak brightness, maybe color saturation, maybe near black handling, right? When you put the meters on these Sonys, they appear to fall short of their LG competitors, whether it's the G1, G2, or recently the QD OLED, Samsung's S95C, S95D, this year's S95F. Nevertheless, all 5 of these Sony TVs from 2018, 2019 until today, they win what? The king of TVs, again and again and again and again and again. And these are judges, right? The judges don't look at spec sheets, they don't look at meters, they look at movie scenes, they see the Sony, they see the competitors, they see the reference monitor, and they go, I like the Sony. There is a pattern to this madness, and Sony is just focused on one thing. How do movies look? Are skin tones natural? And it's a philosophy that has not changed. So with that in mind, this principle is a trickle-down principle. Even the cheapest, least expensive TV can follow this principle, just with less specs or with lower quality parts, right? It doesn't matter. The principle stands. LCD TVs are the easiest for me to complain about because LCD TVs, their performance are defined by dimming zones. The number of dimming zones, whether it's mini LED or LCD without mini LED, it doesn't matter. Every Sony TV I have ever reviewed have fallen behind in the dimming zone count compared to a TCL of all brands, right? An upstart, Hisense, and Samsung, right? Samsung used to be the #1 in dimming zones. Recently, they've been surpassed by TCL, but it doesn't matter. As an example, in 2023, the X90L was released. Oh my gosh, I was so disappointed. Was that less than 100 dimming zones for a 65-inch? And the QM8 at the time destroyed it in dimming zone count. We're talking 1,000 dimming zones at least, I believe. But at the end, when I had the TV side by side, and you can check out my review from several years ago, I was like, wait a minute, this X90L looks amazing. Because ultimately, everyone, you Sony fans have been telling me this, Sony's software is optimized for the hardware, taking that hardware to its maximum performance. Whereas TCL or Hisense, they have the hardware, but their software leaves a lot on the table. In other words, all that hardware excess, the software doesn't even know how to take advantage of it. Whereas Sony, with the few dimming zones that they have, they push those dimming zones to perform at their best. And so what you have is an X90L with much less dimming zones than a QM8, but in scene after scene, I was like, wait, whoa. TV shows, sports, doesn't matter. Looks the same. And I prefer the Sony look. I don't have to calibrate it. Skin tones are natural. TCL, you have to calibrate it. It was just too oversaturated in red or magenta. I mean, it's just a lot of craziness back then with TCL. Every TCL TV had to be calibrated because out of the box, they were just not natural. And so ultimately, I ended up recommending a similarly priced X90L over the QM8, even though the QM8 on paper is a superior TV. But that's on the low end. On the high end, flagship, how many dimming zones are needed? And I think Sony's figured it out with the Bravia 9. They have just enough. We're not talking too much, definitely not too little. The Bravia 9 with over 1,500 dimming zones, just over 1,500 dimming zones at the 65-inch size, nailed it. And when I say nailed it, this is why. When they released the Bravia 9 back in 2024, early 2024, I thought, wow, this is an amazing TV because it's the best that Sony has ever produced among LCD TVs. It had this new innovative 22-bit backlight and the most dimming zones ever on its 65-inch size and across the board. And you're thinking, okay, this has got to be awesome. But then TCL released even more dimming zones on the QM851G with over 2,800 dimming zones. And I thought, okay, Bravia 9, you're outclassed. You're more than 1,000 dimming zones short. Boy, was I wrong. The Bravia 9 wiped the floor with every other LCD TV, mini LED, from last year. It wasn't even close. The Bravia 9 had amazing contrast, deep blacks, better specular highlights. The brightness was off the charts in terms of where it needed to be accurate. Out of the box, it looked amazing. Nothing came close. The Bravia 9 ran away with it. And so TCL this year thought, all right, we learned our lesson. Clearly, not enough dimming zones, right? Because, come on, the Sony had, what, a little over 1,500? We had 2,800? Not enough. This year, the QM9K, over 3,000 dimming zones, and a 23-bit backlight system. If we can't beat them with hardware last year, we'll hit them even harder this year. Guess what? The Bravia 9 handily beat the QM9K. Now, the QM9K got closer. Its color accuracy was a bit better, but black level shadow detail, not a match. Specular highlights, not as bright. Yes, I know they advertised over 6,000 peak specular highlights, but that's on a meter. That's on special patterns, whatever. In real movies, that does require brightness. We're talking Alpha, Mad Max. Guess who's brighter? Accurately brighter, not just brighter for the sake of brightness. It was the Bravia 9. Jennifer Gall's content. Everything that required brightness over 4,000 nits, the Bravia 9 both hit higher peak specular highlights and better tone mapping, better accuracy, just across the board. Nailed it. And I thought, whoa, wait, are we at the point of diminishing returns for dimming zones? Because clearly, the Bravia 9 with less than half the dimming zones of the QM9K easily beat the QM9K. So what does that tell you? Definitely, dimming zones are important, but at some point, your software need to be able to control those dimming zones. Now, that's not to say that if the Bravia 9 had 3,000 dimming zones, it wouldn't look better. Now, we'll find out next year because RGB LED is coming. This is the next generation of the Bravia 9, right? The Bravia 9 Mark II, maybe. It will have more dimming zones and even higher performing mini LEDs. 3 sets or 3 different colors. Current mini LED is all white. Next generation will be red, green, blue, more control, right? More bit levels. Can it surpass the Bravia 9? Because apparently no one else can in the LCD TV space. We'll see. I think the Bravia 9 is that epitome of software and hardware, but it goes back to the Sony Tax. Who is this for? These are the qualities of the Sony buyer. First, it's all about the movies. You don't care about the specs. You don't care about anything else other than you open the box and you don't want to play with settings. That's number 2. You hate tweaking settings. Set it in one mode, let it go. It looks great. Scene after scene, source after source. It doesn't matter. And 3, gaming is not quite important to you, right? Sony TVs, For console gaming, they're fine. Casual console gamers. But if you're serious about the latest and the greatest, the best, you want the HGIG. Yes, I know Sony has said that its default game mode is HGIG, even though they don't say it. But gamers, they're a particular lot. I get it. And four, lastly, you got to have the cojones not to care that Sony TVs will never win the spec war. They're never going to have the brightest 6500 nits or whatever is the bright spec to beat that year. They'll never be the brightest. They'll never have the most dimming zones. They may never have the most anything. And most importantly, though, they'll be winning shootouts and competitions and comparisons. But let's put my money where my mouth is. What are my Sony TVs that I watch regularly? 3 TVs, 2 of them are Sony's. Bedroom is a Sony A95K, and here in the studio, when I watch all types of stuff, sports, testing, whatever I need, Bravia 9. So the A95K and the Bravia 9 are my Sony tools of choice. And the third TV, my main watching TV, or should I say TV, 120-inch screen, Hisense L9Q laser TV, because ultimately for me, when the lights go down, I want size and immersion. Nothing beats a 120-inch screen, and currently my favorite and best ultra short throw is the Hisense L9Q. But as for TVs, Sony is not the only TV brand that's charging that tax. Next up is the $8,000 98-inch Samsung QN90F. Suddenly that Bravia 5 at 98 inches for $4,000 sounds like a deal, doesn't it? Let me know in the comments below. Are you a Sony fan? Are you paying the tax? Until next time, stop the FOMO.